The Age of Enlightenment. From the end of the 17th century to the 18th century, the Enlightenment was an age of questioning, understanding, and discovery of the natural world. But what led to this age of questioning, understanding, and discovery? Individualism and empiricism are the cornerstones of Enlightened thought. These crucial foundations of the Enlightenment are simply further amplified by the distinct engine responsible for the establishment of the Enlightenment itself: individuals. The Age of Enlightenment was an era of unprecedented strides in the world of science. It is of my opinion that, had the Enlightenment not have happened, the justification for the establishment of the greatest country in the history of the universe would have amounted to no more than a revolution. Thomas Jefferson, my son, took after my personal reasoning on the belief that everyone is entitled to life, liberty, and property. The separation of church and state is the pinnacle of a nation's success. Why should you believe in the Enlightenment? Simple. According to George Washington, the first president of the greatest country in the history of the universe, said that I am, and I quote, the greatest man who had ever lived. Divine right is not empirical. Simple as that. Why should a divinely ordained human being exist in the presence of natural law? I wrote a book, the name of which I took from a book of a bigger book, which, as we all know, came from divine authority. I believe that the majority of mankind can and will not prosper in the absence of a dictatorial power. People, therefore, must need a strong, competent ruler that is able to oversee and control the ravages of mankind. The sovereignty of such a being should go unchallenged solely for the purpose of preventing an outbreak of civil war. Society must be willing to sacrifice certain unnecessary individual liberties for the security and betterment of the nation as a whole. The Enlightenment was simply a catalyst to the progression of human thinking. No longer are we limited to the dogma of ancient philosophers. Instead, we are able to set the bounds of mankind's potential. Rationalism comes from the mind's mental reasoning, while empiricism is the engine from which we obtain the observable certainties of the world. Combining the two, in what I have coined as dualism, provides us with the guaranteed knowledge of why things happen the way they do. The existence of dualism and the philosophy of it can be summed up in one phrase: cogito ergo sum, or as laymen say, I think, therefore I am. Think about it. The metaphysical description of how things work lie in the simple understanding of our very conscious discernment. Thinking, and realizing your thinking, manifests the certainty of a physical perception that is fueled by the fact your mental attribution is functioning on a level of quantifiable intelligence. Deism. The justification that allows for the separation of church and state is at the core of the Enlightenment. Until now, the ability of science itself has been suppressed by the tyranny of religious orthodoxy. The Roman Catholic Church has always been the model for societal acceptability, despite the often lacking amount of piety among its followers. Why, then, should the entirety of the European scientific community be stigmatized by a body of hypocrites? There was a book, written by my dad, Erasmus, who condemned the religious impracticality of the Roman Catholic Church. Thieving his interpretation of religion, I wrote A Letter on Toleration, which will hopefully open the eyes of Europe to the true meaning of enlightened thought. I say, since the church and state are separated on the basis of empirical science, why then can't we have a toleration of religion on the basis of individual liberty? It was the people of France that fueled my ambitions to spread Enlightenment ideals. It was the year 1751, and discontent throughout the old regime was rampant. My colleague, Jean Laurent d'Alembert, conceived an idea to write a source of information that common people could access. The Enlightenment rests on the idea of information. Therefore, the only true way to propel the Enlightenment is to get information into the hands of as many people as possible. D'Alembert grouped this necessary information into a single volume called the Encyclopédie. The Encyclopédie contained sentiment pertaining to revolution, natural rights, and empirical approaches to science. Of course, this was an enormous project that required D'Alembert to seek my assistance as official editor. Completed and ready to print, the encyclopedia was pumped throughout Europe, cataclysmically fueling individual sentiment in France's third estate. To put it simply, had the encyclopedia not been written, the ideals of the Enlightenment would have been confined to the minds who devised them. This restriction on Enlightenment thought would include the inherent obstruction of any possible justification for the French Revolution in 1789. The Enlightenment was based off of the individual analysis of worldly occurrences. These observations, attained through the use of empirical devices, extend to all facets of the social sphere, including government. By the acquisition of understanding of natural law, mankind is able to establish the proper role that government should have over a populace. I have formulated a concept known as the separation of powers that will act as a checks and balances system to regulate the influence government has in accordance to law. There should be three branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. A constitution is a cornerstone to a country's success, not simply in the establishment of it, but in the adherence to it. Individualism is now, through the eyes of the Enlightenment, the engine of sovereignty and preservation from the horrors of tyranny. However, if the nation's people do not accept the responsibility that self-government entails, the consequences from such negligence exponentially outweigh the repercussions resulting from a dictatorial state. Since this is the case, democracy, with the exclusion of enslaved individuals, is vital to the prosperity of a nation and to the keeping of individual liberty among the populace. It is the quality of understanding the world around us paired with the utmost protection of democracy. That is what the Enlightenment is truly about. The entirety of human history is filled with the injustice of a dictatorial power that acts outside the general welfare of the populace. Understanding a social contract between government and people is the key to a nation's success. Moreover, a social contract grants a people the dignity of having influence over the political powers that oversee the shaping of their nation. A government is intended to conform to the pleas of the people, despite the inverse often taking effect in a country. I like to think of myself as the father of a philosophy that Jeremy Bentham is famed for. I call it utilitarianism, or in other words, democracy on steroids. Because polarization occurs in every facet of societal discourse, how then can the people rest assured that their well-being is properly secured in regards to legislative action? Popularity, majority. Despite the possibility of moral dissent, the government shall be held accountable to the protection of the rights of every citizen through the implementation of political law based on the consensus of the majority. I have no understanding of how humanity will progress without the aid of a higher intellectual capacity for reasons behind worldly occurrences. The skeptical mind is the mentality that will truly progress humanity to the pinnacle of understanding. By definition, skepticism is the engine by which we understand information. Obtaining information is one thing, but processing and understanding that information resides on the level of actually having the capacity for contributing to society. Every bit of information should be taken with a grain of salt, as some say. This skeptical outlook only ensures the highest level of assurance of what the physical world involves in relation to inevitable occurrences. My contemporary, Immanuel Kant, directly contributes to my philosophy in the belief that knowledge is a death to humanity. Knowing something, but not understanding, supersedes the devastative nature of simple ignorance. This, therefore, is the reason behind my philosophy of skepticism. Why everyone must fully understand the information they acquire in order to adequately preserve the future of humanity. The greatest effect of the Enlightenment resides in the penetrating influence it had on the economy. The economy itself is the fuel for progress and advancement. Society shapes the economy, or, in other words, the choices and dependencies of a people drive and cause the market to conform to those needs. In a literal sense, the Enlightenment opened the eyes of society. But in doing so, the Enlightenment broke down the doors of collectivism that had stigmatized the market's potential. Capitalism is truly the scientific way to look at the nature of humanity. The approach to the probable relationship between man and world must be done in a fashion that truly analyzes the qualities of humankind. Those qualities are not necessarily greed or narcissism. Rather, they are an internal drive to satisfy the wants and needs of others in an effort to produce the lifestyle they deserve. If one does not deserve something they desire, the market will account for that through means of ensuring the qualities of products and the price of those products in accordance with supply and demand. Therefore, laziness is intolerable in a capitalistic society which inherently cancels the possibility of stagnation. Progress, not for the sake of progress, is the true meaning of humanity's natural rights and the competency for progress to be acquired at the expense of no one, but for the betterment of all. Never in history has the world seen such a drastic alteration of human potential for the understanding of the natural world. What would Europe look like today if another noticeable historical event like the Renaissance not have taken place? Religiously indifferent, economically unchanged, etc. The greatest contribution that some historians consider the most crucial period in European history is seemingly only responsible for cultural impact. Cultural altercation is obsolete in the scheme of understanding due to its inherent reliance on the economic and scientific impacts that allow for the actual culture's understanding. If arguably one of the most influential periods in history, the Renaissance, ended up being dependent on the formation of an economically accepting population and dogmatic thinkers of classicism and stagnation, what then would Europe be like today if the Enlightenment not have taken place? Today, the basis on which we run society, economies, and government is lesser dependent on dynasticism, collectivism, and subjectivism, but is rather largely dependent on the ideals of Enlightenment thinking, such as meritocracy, individualism, and objectivism. What has this led to? In the nations that accept Enlightenment ideals, religious freedom, individual possession of natural rights that go unchallenged, economic mobility, and the list goes on. In short, the Enlightenment is responsible for possibly one of the greatest overall improvements towards humanity's future.